He drove away laughing, leaving me stranded in Italy with nothing but $37 and a shattered heart. 1 year later, he tracked me down in Greece, only to find I wasn't his victim anymore, but the owner of the very ground he stood on. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The rental car sped away, throwing gravel against my shins, and the sound of Gabriel laughing with his friends echoed off the ancient stone walls of the Italian alleyway. My husband had just abandoned me in a town whose name I could not pronounce, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a small purse. The taillights grew smaller, disappearing around a bend, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and disbelief. I checked my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed his number for the 10th time. It went straight to voicemail. I tried Pete, then Marco, the two college buddies who had been egging Gabriel on all through lunch. Every single call was blocked. They thought this was a game, a lesson in humility, because I had asked Gabriel to stop drinking and head back to the hotel. She is always controlling you, Pete had sneered at the cafe, and Gabriel had decided to prove him wrong by proving he could throw me away whenever he liked. I stood there as the sun began to dip behind the Tuscan hills, the picturesque charm of the village turning into a dark, suffocating maze. My stomach knotted as I realized my credit cards were in Gabriel's wallet, tucked into his pocket when he offered to carry them earlier. I opened my purse and counted the cash. €80 and $37. That was it. That was the price of my life in that moment. I looked at the locals enjoying their dinner at sidewalk tables, their curious stares making the heat of humiliation rise to my face. I was the wife of a respected Boston architect, a woman who managed a social calendar and a designer home, now reduced to a stranded tourist with less than $100 to her name. I found the cheapest room possible, a dingy space above a bakery where the air smelled of yeast and damp stone. The elderly woman who owned it didn't speak a word of English, but she saw my tear-streaked face and patted my arm with a heavy, sympathetic hand. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at the blank screen of my phone. Gabriel would come back in the morning, I told myself. He would say it was a joke, that I was overreacting, and we would go back to our carefully constructed life. But as the hours stretched into the middle of the night, and the silence of the town grew absolute, I knew the joke had become my reality. I woke up to the smell of fresh bread and the cold realization that no one was coming for me. I spent the day walking the perimeter of the town, checking every hotel and restaurant for the tour group, but they were gone. They had moved on to Florence, leaving me behind like a piece of luggage they no longer wanted to carry. By the third day, the €80 were nearly gone, and the panic was a physical weight in my chest. I stood in front of a small, cramped pawn shop, my hand trembling as I reached for my wedding ring. It was a 2-carat diamond, the upgrade Gabriel had bought for our 5th anniversary to show the world how successful we were. The shopkeeper looked at it through a loop and offered me a fraction of its value, but it was enough to buy a ticket out of this nightmare. He suggested I call my family, but I couldn't bear the thought of my mother's voice saying she told me so about Gabriel's temper. I looked at the bus station's electronic board, the names of destinations blurring. I saw Greece. It was far away, across the sea, a place where Gabriel would never think to look for me. I remembered how he used to hide my design portfolios, telling me we didn't need the money, and he needed me focused on our home. He had built a cage out of comfort, and I had walked right into it. The ticket agent, a woman with kind eyes, asked me where I wanted to go. Greece, I said, the word feeling like a spark of electricity in my throat. I want the furthest coastal village you can get me to. I boarded the bus as the rain started to fall, leaving the Italian town behind. I watched the window, my reflection looking like a ghost of the woman I used to be. My phone battery died somewhere near the border, cutting me off from the world I knew. I had no plan and no safety net. I was heading toward a horizon I couldn't see, driven by a desperate need to be anywhere but where Gabriel expected me to be. The journey was a blur of uncomfortable seats, the smell of salt air, and the constant, gnawing hunger. When I finally stepped off the last bus in a tiny Greek village, my body was stiff, and my vision was tunneling from exhaustion. The whitewashed buildings blinded me under the relentless sun, and the scent of olive groves was thick in the air. I wandered toward the center of the village, my feet blistering inside the designer sandals that were never meant for this. I didn't know the language, and I had no more money. The world began to tilt, the silver-green leaves of the trees shimmering like coins before my eyes. My knees buckled, and the dusty ground rushed up to meet me. I felt a strange sense of peace as the darkness edged in. I was abandoned in one country and collapsing in another, a perfect end to the story Gabriel had started. But then I felt hands on my shoulders, weathered and strong, turning me over. A woman's voice, sharp with concern, called out to someone. She pressed a canteen to my lips, the water reviving me just enough to see her lined face and kind eyes. She said her name was Elena. She helped me to my feet, her small frame surprisingly powerful as she guided me toward a stone farmhouse nestled among the trees. The kitchen smelled of herbs and something savory bubbling on a stove that looked 100 years old. Her husband, Nikos, appeared in the doorway, his face darkened by the sun. They didn't ask for my passport or my credit cards. They gave me a bowl of soup and a bed with the handmade quilt. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized I had survived the first few days of my new life, but the fear of what came next was still waiting for me in the shadows. In the morning, Elena brought me a simple cotton dress and a pair of sturdy boots that had belonged to her daughter. They were worn but clean, and they felt more real than any of the silk dresses sitting in my closet in Boston. I used a translation app on my phone, which Nikos had managed to charge, to thank them and tell them I needed to leave. But Elena shook her head, pointing at my blistered feet and the rain beginning to lash the windows. "Stay," she said. It was one of the few English words she knew. I stayed for a day, then 2, then 3. I began to help Elena with the chickens and the laundry, my city-soft hands struggling with the physical labor. Nikos showed me how to pull weeds in the vegetable garden, his patience infinite as I made mistakes. I was a designer, a woman of aesthetics, yet I found a strange satisfaction in the dirt under my fingernails. At night, we sat on the porch, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the occasional puff of Nikos's pipe. I told Elena about Gabriel, the words pouring out in a language she didn't understand, but emotions she recognized. I told her about the years of making myself smaller, of the humiliation of being left on a street corner like trash. She took my hand, pointing to her heart and then to the farm. She was offering me a place, a purpose. I looked at the vast olive groves stretching out under the moonlight and realized I didn't want to go back to the cage. "I want to work," I told her. "I stay." Elena's smile was the most beautiful thing I had seen in years. She squeezed my hand, sealing a deal that would change everything. The next morning, we were in the grove before the sun was up. The work was brutal. My shoulders burned as I used wooden rakes to comb the olives onto nets, and my hands were covered in fresh blisters by noon. "Boston lady hands," Elena teased, but she brought me a homemade salve of beeswax and herbs that took the sting away. "Tomorrow better," she promised. And she was right. Within weeks, my muscles hardened, and the constant mental replay of the betrayal began to fade. I learned how to sort the olives, separating the premium fruit from the ones used for soap. I learned the rhythm of the land, the way the soil felt after a rain, and the precise moment the fruit was ready for the press. Nikos began to treat me like an apprentice, teaching me the secrets of the oil that had sustained his family for generations. My designer clothes grew loose as I became lean and strong, my skin tanning deep under the Greek sun. I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked substantial, grounded, and alive. I started going to the village market with them, helping to sell the golden green oil to locals and tourists. Elena handed me an envelope of euros after our first big day. "Your part," she said. "Fair work, fair pay." I held that money like it was made of gold. It was the first time in a decade I had earned my own living, independent of Gabriel's bank accounts and his monitoring eyes. I felt a surge of pride that nearly brought me to my tears. I was building a life from nothing, and for the first time, the foundation was mine. But as I walked through the market, I saw a man in a tailored suit who looked just enough like Gabriel to make my heart stop, and I realized that my past wasn't as far behind me as I hoped. The man at the market wasn't Gabriel, but the shadow he cast over my thoughts lingered for days. I threw myself deeper into the work, spending long hours in the processing shed where the scent of pressed olives was heavy and intoxicating. I began to look at the business side of the farm, realizing that Elena and Nikos were still using handwritten ledgers and outdated methods. I spent my evenings at the kitchen table, creating digital spreadsheets and inventory trackers on my phone. When I showed Elena how we could track which markets were the most profitable, her eyes widened. "Smart," she said, tapping her temple. "Boston lady brain, good for business." With their blessing, I started making small changes. I designed new labels for the bottles, using my background in design to create something that looked as premium as the oil inside. I wrote brochures in English for the tourists, explaining the traditional methods we used. Our sales began to climb, and soon we were being approached by local restaurants in the neighboring towns. Stavis, the owner of the village taverna, became our biggest advocate, placing our oil on every table. "You bring new life to Old Grove," the village priest told me one afternoon. It was the highest compliment I could receive. I was no longer a guest. I was becoming part of the village. I attended baptisms and name day celebrations, my Greek improving with every conversation. I made a friend in Yana, a weaver who worked the stall next to ours. She was sharp and direct, and she was the first one to ask me why I never spoke about my life in America. "You never say his name," Yana said one evening as we packed up our goods. "The husband who left you." "Gabriel," I said, the name feeling heavy and strange. "He never searched for you?" I told her I didn't know, that I had abandoned my old accounts and kept my phone off. Yana looked at me with a piercing gaze. "Perhaps it is time to look," she said, "not for him, but for you. To close the door." That night, I sat in my small room and powered on my old phone. The screen lit up with hundreds of notifications. Emails from friends who had been worried. Messages from my former design mentor about a job opportunity. And then, at the top of the list, a message from Gabriel sent only hours before. "I know where you are," the subject line read. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. He told me he had hired a private investigator, that he was coming to Athens on Thursday to bring me home and end this ridiculous tantrum. He expected me to be ready, like a dog waiting for its master. The rage that boiled up inside me was colder and sharper than anything I had felt before. He still thought he owned me. He still thought I was the weak woman he had left on that Italian street corner. I went downstairs, the phone clutched in my hand, and found Elena waiting. "Gabriel is coming," I told her. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't look surprised. She reached under the ledger and pulled out an envelope. "Good timing, then," she said. Inside were legal papers, a partnership agreement for the farm. 1/3 business yours, she explained. Now, not future. You choose what happens Thursday. I spent the next 3 days in a fever of preparation. I didn't pack a suitcase. Instead, I visited the village lawyer, a woman named Katerina, and had her help me draft divorce papers in both Greek and English. I responded to my design mentor, tentatively accepting the remote consulting work she had offered. I was building my fort, brick by brick. Thursday arrived with a sky so clear it looked painted. I was in the processing shed, my hands stained with oil, when the sound of a rental car engine broke the quiet of the afternoon. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face set in a look of grim resolve. "He is here," she said. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped out into the sun. Gabriel stood beside a silver sedan, looking completely out of place in his designer chinos and perfectly coiffed hair. He looked at the farmhouse with visible distaste, as if he couldn't believe his wife had been living in such a primitive place. When he saw me, the shock on his face was almost comical. He stared at my work boots, my tanned arms, and my hair pulled back in a simple kerchief. "My God, Alexis, what happened to you?" he asked, his voice filled with the familiar condescension that used to make me shrink. "Life happened," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "What are you doing here, Gabriel?" He stepped forward, his practiced charm sliding into place as he reached out his arms. "I've come to take you home, of course. This has gone on long enough." I stayed well out of his reach. "This isn't about making a point, Gabriel," I said. "This is about making a life." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that reminded me of the alley in Italy. "A life? You're a designer, not a peasant. I admit, leaving you was a drunken mistake, and I'm sorry. Now, let's get your things." Behind me, Elena and Nico stepped out of the house, standing like silent guardians. Gabriel glared at them. "Are these the people who have been holding you?" I cut him off. "They've been teaching me," I said, "about community, about kindness, and about what it means to actually work for something. I'm a partner here now. I have a business." Gabriel's face flushed with anger. "A business? Be serious. You're coming home to Boston. Our reputation is at stake. People are asking questions. You're embarrassing me." I looked at him and realized that he didn't care about me at all. He cared about the image of us, the accessory I provided for his successful life. "You didn't even notice I was unhappy, did you?" I asked. He shook his head, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We had a beautiful home and financial security. What more could you want?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope Katerina had prepared. "Purpose," I said. "An agency. These are divorce papers, Gabriel, already filed." He stared at the envelope as if I had handed him a snake. "You can't be serious. You're throwing everything away for a dirt farm?" "I'm not throwing anything away," I said, stepping forward to press the papers into his hand. "I'm choosing something real. You left me, Gabriel. You drove away laughing. You just never expected I would find my way without you." His fingers closed around the papers, his expression shifting from shock to a cold, wounded pride. "You'll regret this," he spat. "When the novelty wears off, and you're hauling olives in the sun at 60, you'll remember what you gave up." "Maybe," I conceded, "but I'd rather risk regret from choices I made than live with the certainty of regret from choices made for me." Nico stepped forward then, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. He said something in Greek, his voice low and commanding. "What did he say?" Gabriel asked, his voice sounding smaller now. "He said the road back to Athens is dangerous after dark," I translated. "You should leave now." Gabriel looked at the three of us, finally realizing that there was no negotiation to be had. He turned and got back into his car, the tires kicking up dust as he sped away. Elena slipped her hand into mine as we watched the car disappear. "We have work to do," she said. I looked at the groves, my groves, and felt a peace that was deeper than anything I had ever known. Gabriel had tried to break me, but he had accidentally set me free. The weeks following Gabriel's departure were filled with a strange electric energy. The village seemed to lean in closer, as if the finality of my decision had unlocked a new level of acceptance. Katerina, the lawyer, worked quickly on the Greek side of the divorce, while I spent my nights coordinating with a legal team in Boston. I was using the money I earned from the olive oil sales and my new consulting job to fund my own freedom, and every euro spent felt like a victory. I started the remote design work, sitting at the worn wooden table in the farmhouse kitchen with my laptop. It was a sustainable building materials company, and my first project was to help them design modular housing for displaced communities. It was a far cry from the high-end residential interiors I used to do for Gabriel's colleagues, and I loved every second of it. Elena would watch me work, her eyes full of curiosity as I sketched on the screen. "Beautiful thinking," she would say, tapping her temple just like she did when I first showed her the spreadsheets. I realized then that I didn't have to choose between my old life and my new one. I was building a hybrid, a version of myself that was both the creative professional and the woman who knew how to harvest a crop with her own hands. But as the business grew, so did the challenges. A large agricultural conglomerate from Athens began scouting land in our valley, making aggressive offers to the smaller farmers. They wanted to consolidate the groves and turn them into a high-intensity industrial operation, which would destroy the traditional methods Nikos had spent his life perfecting. The representative for the conglomerate, a man named Dmitri, started appearing at the market. He was slick, with a sharp suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He approached our stall one afternoon, looking over our hand-labeled bottles with a dismissive air. "You have a nice little operation here," he said in perfect English, looking directly at me. "But it's not sustainable in the modern market. My company can offer you a price that would allow these old people to retire in luxury." I saw Nikos's jaw tighten, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. "We are not selling," I said, stepping in front of Nikos. Dmitri laughed, a sound that was far too similar to Gabriel's. "Everyone has a price, Alexis. I know your history. I know you're used to a certain level of comfort. Don't let sentimentality ruin your future." I felt a cold chill go down my spine. He had done his research. He knew who I was. I realized then that this wasn't just about land, it was a targeted attack. Gabriel's family had connections in the Greek business world, and I began to suspect that my husband hadn't given up as easily as I thought. He couldn't force me to come home, so he was trying to destroy the home I had built. I spent the next several days talking to the other farmers in the village. Many of them were tempted by Dimitri's offers. Their children had moved to the cities, and they were tired of the back-breaking work. "If we don't sell, the conglomerate will just buy the land around us and cut off our access to the water and the roads," Yana warned me. "They play dirty." I knew I had to act fast. I stayed up late into the night, researching Greek land use laws and agricultural subsidies. I found a European Union grant for the preservation of traditional farming techniques and heritage groves. If I could get the village farmers to form a cooperative, we could apply for the grant together and protect our land as a collective. But it required trust, and I was still an outsider to many. I organized a meeting at the taverna, inviting everyone who owned a grove in the valley. The room was thick with the smell of tobacco and tension. I stood before them, my hands shaking as I explained the plan. I showed them the numbers, the potential for growth if we marketed our oil as a premium heritage brand. I told them that our strength was in our history, not in industrial efficiency. Dmitri stood in the back of the room, his presence a silent threat. You're asking them to risk everything on the word of a woman who has been here for 5 minutes, he shouted. My company offers guaranteed cash. The room erupted into heated arguments. I saw the doubt on the faces of people I had shared meals with, people I had worked alongside in the fields. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I was failing. But then Elena stood up. She was the oldest person in the room, and the silence that fell was immediate. This woman came to us with nothing, Elena said, her voice clear and strong. She worked until her hands bled. She brought us into the modern world without asking us to give up our souls. She is not an outsider. She is our daughter. She sat down, and the shift in the room was palpable. Nico stood next, followed by Stavis and then Yana. One by one, the farmers agreed to join the cooperative. We signed the initial papers right there on the wine-stained tables of the taverna. Dmitri's smile finally vanished, and he walked out into the night without a word. It was a massive win, but as I walked back to the farm under the stars, I saw a black car parked at the end of the driveway. A man was leaning against the hood, the cherry of his cigarette glowing in the dark. It wasn't Dmitri. It was Gabriel's brother, Marcus, the family fixer. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. Gabriel is miserable, Alexis, he said, his voice smooth and dangerous. And when Gabriel is miserable, the family business suffers. You've made your point, but this cooperative nonsense is interfering with some very important deals. I was stunned. So the conglomerate was connected to the Davis family. Gabriel was using his family's reach to crush a tiny Greek village just to spite me. You're pathetic, I said, my voice dripping with contempt. Tell Gabriel that every time he tries to push me, I'm just going to push back harder. Marcus stepped into my space, the scent of expensive cologne and tobacco overpowering the smell of the olives. You think you're safe here because you have some papers and a few old farmers? This is Greece, Alexis. Things happen. Fires start in dry groves. Water lines get cut. Don't be a martyr for a place that doesn't belong to you. He got into the car and drove off, leaving me standing in the dark with a cold knot of fear in my stomach. They weren't just going after the business anymore. They were threatening our lives. I went inside and looked at Elena and Nikos, sleeping peacefully in the next room, and I knew I couldn't tell them. I had brought this danger to their door, and I had to be the one to end it. The threat from Marcus hung over the farm like a gathering storm. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every sound outside, convinced that the flicker of a firefly was the beginning of an arsonist's match. I spent my days working in the groves with Nikos, my eyes constantly scanning the horizon for black cars or unfamiliar faces. I realized that the cooperative was our best defense, but it was also our biggest vulnerability. If the conglomerate could break one of us, the whole thing would crumble. I decided to use my design consulting income to hire a local security firm from the city to patrol the valley. It was a massive expense, but I framed it to the village as a necessary step for the heritage certification process. I didn't want to spread panic, but I saw the way Yana looked at me, her sharp eyes picking up on my frayed nerves. You are carrying too much, Alexis, she said one afternoon as we sorted olives. I told her everything then, about Marcus, the conglomerate's true ties, and the threats. Yana didn't flinch. In this village, we have survived wars and dictators, she said. A spoiled man from Boston is nothing. But we must be smart. We decided to fight fire with information. If the Davis family was using their influence to push the conglomerate's agenda, we would expose them. I contacted a journalist I knew back in Boston, a woman who specialized in corporate malfeasance and the intersection of private wealth and international land grabs. I sent her everything I had: the conglomerate's shell company filings, the connections to the Davis family's holding companies, and the recorded threats from Dimitri. While I waited for her to dig deeper, I focused on the cooperative's first major harvest under the New Heritage label. We were aiming for a limited run, high-end release that would go directly to specialty retailers in Europe and the US. It was a gamble. If the quality wasn't perfect, or if the marketing failed, we would be broke. Elena and I spent hours in the kitchen, testing different blends of the oil, looking for that perfect balance of peppery finish and buttery start. We were close, so close, when the first blow landed. The village water supply was suddenly diverted. The local official in charge of irrigation claimed there was a technical malfunction and that repairs would take weeks. In the middle of the driest month of the year, our trees began to wilt. The leaves curled and the fruit started to shrivel. I knew it wasn't a malfunction. I went to the irrigation office, but the man behind the desk refused to look me in the eye, citing paperwork and procedures that didn't exist. I felt the walls closing in. Without water, the harvest would be lost, and the cooperative would fail before it even began. Some of the farmers started talking about Dimitri's offer again. "At least the conglomerate has their own wells," they whispered. I stood in the middle of the withered grove, the dust coating my boots, and felt a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. I wasn't going to let them win by thirst. I called Katerina and had her file an emergency injunction, but I knew the legal system would move too slowly. I needed a more immediate solution. I remembered Nikos telling me about an old, forgotten well on the far edge of the property, one that hadn't been used since the great drought of the 70s. We spent an entire night digging, my muscles screaming and my hands raw. Elena and Yana joined us, the four of us working by the light of lanterns. We found the old stone cap and pried it off, the smell of ancient, stagnant water rising up. We lowered a pump I had bought in secret, my heart pounding as Nikos flipped the switch. For a long minute, there was nothing but the hum of the motor. And then, a trickle of cool, clear water began to flow. We cheered, the sound echoing through the dark trees. We spent the next 48 hours hauling hoses across the valley, sharing the water from our secret well with the other members of the cooperative. We saved the trees, but the victory felt fragile. We were fighting a war of attrition, and I knew the Davis family was just getting started. The journalist from Boston called me 2 days later. "Alexis, you've hit a gold mine," she said. "The conglomerate isn't just buying land. They're using it as a front for a massive money laundering operation involving several prominent families in the Northeast. And the Davis family is right at the center of it. If I publish this, it's going to be an international scandal." My heart leaped. This was the leverage I needed, but there was a catch. To make the story stick, she needed a whistleblower from inside the conglomerate's Greek operations. Someone who could provide the specific bank accounts and transaction records. I thought of Dimitri. He was greedy and ambitious, but he was also a mercenary. He didn't have any loyalty to the Davises. He only cared about the highest bidder. I arranged a meeting with him at a quiet cafe 2 towns over. I laid the evidence out on the table, the records of the laundering, the names of the families involved, and the fact that the authorities were already closing in. Dimitri's face went pale. I made him an offer: provide the records to the journalist, and I would make sure his name was left out of the initial indictments. He hesitated, his eyes darting around the cafe. "If they find out, I'm dead," he whispered. "They won't find out until it's too late," I promised. He reached into his briefcase and handed me a thumb drive. "Everything is on there," he said. "Now get out of my sight." I walked out of the cafe, the thumb drive tucked into my bra, feeling like I was carrying a live grenade. The end was in sight, but I knew the most dangerous part was still ahead. The morning the story broke in the Boston Globe and was picked up by the international wires, the village was eerily quiet. I sat on the porch with Elena and Nikos, the tablet screen glowing with the headlines. Boston elite caught in international land grab scandal. The Davis name was featured prominently, along with photos of Gabriel and Marcus. The details were damning. The shell companies, the intimidation tactics, and the laundered funds. By noon, the black car was gone from the driveway and Dmitri had vanished. The conglomerate's local office was shuttered, and a team of investigators from Athens arrived to begin their own inquiry. The technical malfunction with the water was miraculously fixed within hours. The cooperative had won, but the victory felt heavy. I looked at the photos of Gabriel, the man I had once shared a life with, and felt a strange sense of mourning. Not for him, but for the woman I had been when I loved him. She was truly gone now, replaced by someone who knew the cost of every drop of oil we produced. The harvest began in earnest, and it was the most successful in the farm's history. The quality was unparalleled, the oil shimmering like liquid emeralds. We launched the Heritage brand, and the response was overwhelming. Orders poured in from all over the world, many from people who had read the story and wanted to support the small farmers who had stood up to the giants. We were no longer just a farm. We were a symbol of resilience. Elena and Nikos were celebrities in the village, though they took it all with their usual quiet grace. I worked side by side with them, my body now fully attuned to the rhythms of the land. My divorce from Gabriel was finalized shortly after the scandal broke. He lost his firm, his reputation, and most of his assets in the fallout. Marcus was facing a series of criminal charges. I didn't feel joy at their downfall, only a profound sense of relief that they could no longer reach me. I was officially a partner in the Grove, my name on the deeds that had been in Nikos's family for generations. A year to the day since I was left in Italy, I returned to that small town. I didn't go back as a victim, but as a woman who wanted to see where her life had truly begun. I walked down the same narrow alleyway, past the cafe where the argument had happened. It looked smaller than I remembered, less threatening. I sat at one of the sidewalk tables and ordered a glass of wine. The sun was setting, painting the hills in gold and pink, just like it did in Greece. I thought about the €80 and the $37 I had carried. I thought about the fear and the cold bakery room. I realized then that Gabriel hadn't just left me there. He had given me the greatest gift of my life. He had stripped away everything that wasn't real, leaving only the core of who I was. I wasn't just a designer or a farmer. I was a woman who knew how to survive and thrive on her own terms. I returned to Greece the following day, the smell of the olive groves greeting me like a warm embrace. Elena was waiting for me at the farmhouse, a new batch of bread cooling on the table. "Welcome home," she said. I sat down and picked up a piece of bread, dipping it into our own oil. The taste was perfect, bitter, sweet, and strong. I looked out the window at the rows of ancient trees, their leaves silver in the afternoon light. I knew there would be more challenges, more seasons of drought and hard work, but I wasn't afraid. I had roots now, deeper and stronger than anything I had ever known. I was Alexis, the woman of the groves, and my story was only just beginning. I picked up my laptop to start a new design project, a school for the village children that would be funded by the cooperative's profits. As I worked, I heard the sound of laughter from the fields, and I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The phone on the table vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. I hesitated, then opened it. It was a photo of a small, modest wedding ring, the one Gabriel and I had first started with, before the upgrades and the diamonds. The caption read, "I finally found it at the pawn shop. I'm sorry for everything. G." I stared at the screen for a long time, the ghost of my past flickering for a moment. I thought about the woman who would have cried at that message, who would have felt a tug of nostalgia and regret. But that woman didn't live here anymore. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I simply set the phone down and went back to my sketches. The past was a closed book, and I had too much work to do for the future. I stood up and walked out into the grove, the sun warming my skin, ready for whatever the next season would bring. The village school project became my anchor as the dust from the international scandal settled. I spent my mornings coordinating with the construction crew and my afternoons in the groves, my life a constant balance between the digital world of design and the physical world of the harvest. But the peace was shattered when a registered letter arrived from a law firm in Athens. Gabriel was suing for a portion of the Olive Grove's assets, claiming that since we were technically married when the partnership was formed, he was entitled to a share of my interest. It was a move born of pure desperation and spite. He had lost his firm in Boston, and now he was coming after the one thing that had saved me. I felt a surge of nausea as I read the legal jargon, the words marital property and asset division jumping off the page. He didn't want the land. He wanted to force a sale to liquidate my share, knowing it would bankrupt the cooperative and destroy Elena and Nikos's legacy. I took the papers to Katerina immediately. Her office was small, filled with the scent of old paper and strong coffee. She scanned the documents, her brow furrowing. "It's a classic squeeze play," she said. "He's betting that you don't have the resources to fight a prolonged international property dispute. He wants a settlement." I looked at her, my jaw set. "He's not getting a single leaf from these trees," I said. "We need to counter." Katerina nodded, but her expression was grave. "To win this, we need to prove that the partnership was an investment of your labor and separate from marital funds. And we need to do it before the court freezes the farm's accounts. If our cash flow stops, we can't pay the other farmers in the cooperative. The whole system will collapse." I returned to the farm and found Elena and Nikos waiting in the kitchen. I didn't hide the truth from them this time. I explained the lawsuit and the risk to the farm. Elena reached across the table and took my hand, her grip like iron. "We fought for this land before you were born, Alexis," she said. "We will fight for it now." She got up and walked to the small wooden box on the mantel, the one that held her family photos. She pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, the original deed from her grandfather. It had a clause she had never mentioned. The land could only be transferred to those who worked it for a minimum of 3 consecutive harvests. It was an ancient provision designed to keep the groves in the hands of farmers rather than speculators. We had a sliver of hope, but I had only been there for just over a year. I needed 2 more years to satisfy the work requirement of the deed. Gabriel's lawyers knew this. They were pushing for an immediate hearing to bypass the clause. I spent the next 48 hours on the phone with my legal team in Boston and Katerina, trying to find a way to stall. I felt like I was back in Italy, stranded and counting my remaining euros. Except this time, I wasn't alone. The village heard about the lawsuit, and the reaction was immediate. Stavas from the taverna and Yana the weaver organized a labor ledger where every member of the village who had seen me working the groves signed a sworn affidavit. By the end of the week, we had over 200 signatures. It was a powerful display of community, but I knew it might not be enough for a cold-blooded judge in Athens. I needed a way to prove Gabriel had forfeited his right to any claim. I remembered the night he left me. The €80 and $37. I searched through my old travel bag and found the receipt from the bakery pension in Italy where I had spent that first night. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper, but it was proof of abandonment. I sent a scan to Katerina. "This is our leverage," I told her. "He didn't just leave me. He cut off my access to all marital funds, forcing me to pawn my ring just to survive. In any court. That's not just a fight. It's a total breach of marital duty. We weren't just defending a farm. We were putting Gabriel's character on trial." The hearing in Athens was set for a sweltering Tuesday in July. I walked into the courthouse wearing a sharp linen suit, my hair pulled back, looking every bit the professional designer I was, and the fierce farmer I had become. Gabriel was there, sitting at a mahogany table with two high-priced lawyers. He looked haggard, the tan from our Italian trip long faded, replaced by the gray pallor of someone who spent too much time in depositions. He didn't look at me. His lawyers began their opening statement, painting a picture of a lost wife who had used marital prestige to concoct a business deal in a foreign land. They spoke about the Davis family's investment in my life, and how this grove was simply an extension of that. When it was Katerina's turn, she didn't lead with the deed or the labor ledger. She led with the €80. She held up the receipt from the Italian bakery and the pawn shop ticket for the 2-carat diamond ring Gabriel had upgraded on our 5th anniversary. She spoke about the 27 calls to Gabriel that were all sent straight to voicemail while I stood alone on a street corner. The room went silent. She wasn't just talking about money. She was talking about a man who had intentionally stranded his wife with nothing. "This is not a dispute over marital assets," Katerina told the judge. "This is a man trying to profit from a woman he attempted to destroy. He abandoned his responsibilities in Italy. He cannot claim their fruits in Greece." Gabriel finally looked at me then, and for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man who was utterly empty. He tried to speak, but his lawyer pulled him back. The judge spent an hour reviewing the affidavits from the village, the 200 names of people who had watched me sweat, bleed, and work for my place in the grove. He looked at the ancient deed clause that Elena had provided. Then he looked at Gabriel. "The law protects the partnership of marriage," the judge said, his voice echoing in the marble hall. "But the law does not reward cruelty. You left your wife with €80 in a foreign country. You effectively ended the marriage in that alleyway." The judge dismissed the claim with prejudice. Not only was the farm safe, but he ordered Gabriel to pay my legal fees. I walked out of the courtroom into the bright Athens sun, the weight of a decade of control finally falling off my shoulders. Gabriel caught up to me on the courthouse steps. "Alexis, wait!" he called out. I turned, and he looked desperate. "I'm losing everything," he said. "The firm is gone. The house is in foreclosure." I thought we could find a way back. I looked at him, and all I felt was a profound sense of pity. "There is no way back, Gabriel," I said, "because the woman you left in Italy doesn't exist anymore. You helped me kill her." I didn't wait for his response. I got into my car and started the long drive back to the village. I called the farm as I crossed the mountains. Elena answered on the first ring. "It's over," I told her. "The land is ours." I could hear her crying on the other end, a soft, relieved sound that made my own eyes sting. When I pulled into the driveway, the entire village was there. Stavros had brought crates of wine, and Yana had draped the porch in hand-woven banners. We celebrated late into the night, the air filled with music and the smell of roasting lamb. I stood on the edge of the grove, looking at the silver trees under the moonlight. I had fought for this place, and in doing so, I had finally earned it. With the legal shadow gone, the village school moved from a plan to a reality. We broke ground in the fall, the children helping to clear the stones from the site. I used my design skills to create a building that was modern, but respected the traditional architecture, utilizing the sustainable materials from the company I still consulted for. It was the first time my two worlds truly merged. The Heritage Oil Cooperative was flourishing, our bottles now appearing in boutique shops from London to Tokyo. We were no longer just surviving, we were a thriving community. But as the first winter rains began to fall, Nikos's health started to decline. The years of hard labor had taken their toll, and his heart was tired. I spent most of my time at his bedside, reading him the news from the cooperative and the progress of the school. He would listen with a quiet smile, his hand resting on mine. "You have the spirit of the trees, Alexis," he told me one evening, his voice a mere whisper. "Deep roots. Strong heart." He passed away peacefully 2 weeks later, surrounded by the people who loved him. The entire village attended the funeral, a sea of black clothing moving through the olive groves he attended for 70 years. I stood by Elena, her hand trembling in mine, as we said goodbye to the man who had given me a second chance at life. The loss of Nikos left a massive hole in our lives, but his passing also brought a new sense of responsibility. Elena was 68 years old, and she couldn't manage the physical side of the farm alone. I stepped up as the primary manager of the groves, coordinating the harvest and the pressing. I found myself making decisions that Nikos would have made, feeling his presence in every decision. The school was completed in the spring, a beautiful stone and glass building that looked out over the valley. At the opening ceremony, Elena stood before the village and officially handed me the keys to the farmhouse. "This is your home," she said, "not by marriage, but by sweat and by heart." That afternoon, I received a final letter from Boston. It wasn't a legal threat or a plea for help. It was a notification that Gabriel had moved to a small apartment in the suburbs and was working as a junior draftsman at a mid-sized firm. The mighty architect had fallen, but he was working. I felt a strange sense of closure. He was starting over just as I had, but without the foundation of a community to support him. I sat on the porch and watched the sunset, the golden light reflecting off the windows of the new school. I thought about the 14 hours I had spent on that final bus to get here. I thought about the fear of the unknown. I realized that everything I had lost, the house, the status, the perfect marriage, was just noise. What remained was the land, the work, and the people who truly knew me. 2 years after I was left in Italy, the Heritage Oil Cooperative was featured in a major international documentary about sustainable farming. The film crew spent a week with us, capturing the beauty of the groves and the spirit of the village. When the documentary was released, our sales tripled overnight. We were able to fund a community center and a new medical clinic for the village. I was no longer just a partner. I was a leader. I looked at the €80 and $37 I had framed in my office at the school, the exact cash I had when I was abandoned. They were a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I had built. Elena and I were sitting in the kitchen one evening, the same smell of fresh bread and herbs filling the air. She looked at me, her eyes twinkling. "You think you will ever go back?" she asked. "To America?" I looked out the window at the olive trees, their leaves shimmering like silver coins in the breeze. "I am an American, Elena," I said, "but my heart is Greek. I go back for visits, to see my friends and my mentor. But this is where I belong. This is where I found myself." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her knitting. We were a family, bound not by blood, but by the shared experience of saving something beautiful. I walked out into the grove one last time that night. The air was cool and smelled of salt and earth. I touched the bark of one of the 200-year-old trees, feeling the rough, ancient texture. I thought about Gabriel laughing as he drove away in Italy. He had thought he was leaving me with nothing. He didn't realize he was leaving me with the world. I looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched over these trees for centuries. I was free. I was strong. I was home. I picked up a handful of soil, the dark, fertile earth of the valley, and let it sift through my fingers. Sometimes the cruelest actions yield the greatest gifts. Gabriel had tried to break me, but he had accidentally set me free. I turned back toward the farmhouse, the light in the window a beacon in the dark. I had work to do tomorrow. There were olives to harvest, a school to run, and a life to live. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I was going. My name is Alexis, and I am the woman of the olive groves. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.